It was a bitter morning in March when Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived at 221B Baker Street, his boots wet with sleet, and his expression troubled enough to interrupt even Holmes's violin musings. Without preamble, he dropped a sealed folder onto the table and said, "We've got a locked room mystery that defies reason." Holmes set down his instrument. "Excellent. I had feared the day would pass uneventfully," Lestrade explained as he paced. "Last night, celebrated journalist and photographer Ezra Marlowe was found dead in his apartment in Kensington. Shot cleanly through the heart. Door locked from the inside, no sign of forced entry, windows bolted. The building's only entrance is manned by a night porter who swears no one came or went. Any weapon?" Holmes asked, already pulling on his coat. "A pistol on the floor beside him. But it's clean. No prints, no blood spatter. And here's the strangest part: an untouched camera set up on a tripod, facing a chair opposite Marlowe's desk, timer engaged. It snapped a photograph, perfectly focused, just after midnight." "Who was in the chair?" Holmes asked. Lestrade hesitated. "No one. Empty chair." "That's the lie. By the time we reached Marlowe's apartment, the sleet had turned to rain." The scene was pristine in its impossibility. Ezra Marlowe's body lay slumped in the desk chair, his shirt soaked red, eyes wide in what appeared to be genuine surprise. His face was pale but serene, as though he had not struggled. Holmes moved with an energy I recognized from previous impossible cases. He examined the windows, each locked from the inside. The door, as Lestrade had said, showed no signs of tampering. Holmes studied the latch and hinges, then turned his gaze to the walls and ceiling. "There are no vents," I observed. "No, but something is off," Holmes replied. He inspected the camera, an expensive plate model on a sturdy tripod. The film had already been developed by the Yard and sat in the folder Lestrade brought. Holmes picked it up with gloved hands and held it to the light. "It is," he murmured, "an image of absence. This chair in the photo should be occupied." "You think the camera captured a scene that didn't exist?" I asked. "I think it captured a scene meant to deceive," Holmes replied, turning to the camera's viewfinder. "If Marlowe was expecting to photograph someone at midnight, why is the chair empty? And why set the camera at all?" We scoured the room. Nothing seemed out of place, except a small detail Holmes noticed on the desk. A faint crescent of ash, inconsistent with Marlowe's own pipe. It was thinner, darker, a different blend. "Marlowe never smoked cigarettes," Holmes muttered. "He detested them." Lestrade confirmed it, loudly in print. Called them the crutch of the idle mind. "And yet," Holmes said, "we have a single fragment of Turkish tobacco ash. Someone else was here. Someone who smoked and sat in that chair, perhaps just before the photograph was taken." The question returned, how did that person enter and leave? Holmes turned to the walls again. He tapped on the floorboards, testing for hollows. Nothing. The apartment above was vacant. The one below was occupied by a seamstress who reported no unusual sounds. Then Holmes found something. A faint scuff near the edge of the bookshelf. A heavy one, built into the wall. He gripped the side and tugged. It didn't budge. "Watson, help me with this." With effort, we managed to slide the shelf 6 inches forward. Behind it, just a narrow void of space, perhaps 2 feet deep, too small to conceal a man. Holmes stared into it with narrowed eyes. "A crawl shaft," he said. "Barely used. Probably part of an old dumbwaiter system." "But it's sealed at both ends," I said. "Yes," he replied. "Except someone recently unsealed it." He pointed to fresh scratch marks on the wooden frame and the faint scent of oil. Someone had forced it open from the other side, entered the room, committed the murder, and then escaped the same way, resealing the panel to maintain the illusion. But who? Lestrade asked. Holmes picked up a photograph on the desk, one of Marlowe standing with a group of war correspondents. Perhaps the answer lies in Marlowe's last subject. Who was he meeting last night? We don't know, Lestrade admitted. No note, no appointments. But according to his editor, Marlowe was preparing an exposé. On whom, they're not sure. Holmes's eyes brightened. Then we must find out what truth he had uncovered, because it clearly led to his death. As we turned to leave, Holmes paused and looked again at the photograph from the camera.
"There is a lie here,"
he said softly. Not just in what's absent, but in what was meant to be seen. Marlowe planned to trap someone on film, but they were clever enough to erase their presence, visibly, physically, and fatally. And yet, in doing so, they left behind the most telling detail of all. His finger tapped the edge of the image. The shadows don't match. Holmes stood perfectly still, holding the developed photograph at arm's length, his gaze locked on the details that the rest of us had missed. The image, though outwardly plain, a desk, an empty chair, and the neat symmetry of a well-kept room, held within it an inconsistency. The shadows beneath the desk stretched slightly leftward, while those cast by the legs of the chair fell to the right. "Look at the angle," Holmes said. "Two separate light sources. But this room has only one gas fixture overhead. It's impossible." Lestrade frowned. "You think the photograph's been altered?" Holmes shook his head. "Not altered. Contrived. The photographer, or his guest, tampered with the lighting to create an illusion. Someone was sitting in that chair, and they wanted it to look as if no one had been there at all." He stepped across the room to the curtains and pulled them sharply open. The grey daylight did little to brighten the space, but it revealed the angles more clearly. Holmes examined the floor beneath the desk, then returned to the camera's position. "If you move the lamp here," he gestured, "and extinguish the main gaslight, you could cast long shadows behind the chair. A person seated there might be obscured by shadow while the foreground remains crisp. With clever positioning, you could make it seem like an empty chair. So the killer was here," I said, "but positioned himself to vanish in the exposure. Or herself," Holmes added absently. "This was an elaborate ruse. Marlowe knew someone dangerous was coming. He tried to document it, and the killer knew it." We returned to Baker Street, photograph in hand. Holmes sat cross-legged in his chair, deep in thought, his fingers steepled. "There is something else," he said finally. "That Turkish tobacco ash. Do you remember Mrs. Venn, the society columnist?" I asked. "Yes. She once interviewed Marlowe and mentioned, almost offhand, that he refused to allow cigarette smokers in his study. That room was sacred to him. For someone to sit in that chair and smoke." Holmes's voice trailed off. "They were confident," I suggested. "More than that, they wanted to taunt him. Perhaps Marlowe knew his killer. Perhaps he trusted them." A knock at the door interrupted us. "Mrs. Hudson opened it to reveal a young woman in a heavy grey cloak, her eyes red from crying, her hands clasping a soggy handkerchief. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said, voice trembling. "I'm Clara Willoughby. I was engaged to Ezra Marlowe." Holmes gestured gently toward the fire. "Please, Miss Willoughby, sit." She did so, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I read about Ezra this morning. I didn't know where else to go. I haven't spoken to the police. They wouldn't take me seriously. But I saw him just the day before he died. He seemed different." "In what way?" Holmes asked. "He was nervous, distracted. He kept glancing at the clock." saying he had an appointment he couldn't miss but wouldn't tell me who with. Then he asked if I'd ever heard of the Huxley exposure. When I said no, he said, "Good. That means they've buried it well." Holmes's expression sharpened. The Huxley exposure, Clara nodded. He mentioned it only once. Said it was a series of photographs that had disappeared before publication, that they'd ruin careers, bring down a politician. He said maybe more. He seemed afraid. Did he name anyone? No. But he kept looking at his camera, like it was the only thing he trusted. Holmes leaned forward. "Miss Willoughby, did Ezra have a darkroom?" She looked confused. No. He always developed his work at the office, at the Illustrated Weekly. Except, a week ago, he told me not to visit him for a few days. Said he was experimenting with light and needed absolute privacy. I assumed it was for an assignment. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Which means he may have developed something himself. Something dangerous. I think he believed he was being watched, she added. He told me to be careful around his friends, that one of them wasn't what they seemed. Holmes stood abruptly. Then we must revisit the scene. Something is hidden there. Something not meant to be found. Within the hour, we were back in Marlowe's flat. Holmes moved rapidly, checking picture frames, drawer linings, even the hem of the curtains. He paused at a heavy bookcase, knelt, and tapped beneath it, hollow. He drew a pocket knife and pried open a wooden slat. Inside was a flat oilskin envelope. "Watson." I took it gently. Inside were 5 glass negatives, carefully wrapped. Holmes held one up to the light and gasped. Dear God! It showed a man, older, balding, in an expensive overcoat, accepting a small envelope from a uniformed clerk inside a government building. Holmes examined the others. Each captured a moment of bribery, secret meetings, or clandestine correspondence. The final one was a group shot, including the same man standing beside 3 other political figures, one of whom I recognized instantly. Lord Eastbourne, I whispered. A senior cabinet official, Holmes replied. If Marlowe intended to publish these, it would have caused a scandal of the highest order, and someone ensured that never happened. Lestrade entered then, having been summoned. When Holmes showed him the negatives, his face blanched. This is treason, he muttered. No. Holmes corrected. This is what someone went to great lengths to hide, including murder. Lestrade took the envelope, visibly shaken. I'll take these to the Home Office. We'll keep them locked down. Holmes turned back to the scene, thoughtful. One of these men, perhaps more, knew Marlowe had the evidence. They couldn't risk blackmail nor public exposure. They needed to make it look clean. But the photographer outsmarted them in one regard. He left us the lie. And lies, when examined properly, point directly to the truth. I asked, but who pulled the trigger? Holmes's eyes glittered. We are close, Watson. Very close. There is someone still in the shadows, someone whose presence was erased from that photograph. But they made a mistake. And now, we only need one thing. What's that? A keen eye. The camera never lies, but people do. We must speak to those closest to Marlowe. Someone is hiding in plain sight, and the photograph captured more than they realized. Holmes wasted no time. With the negatives secured and Lestrade sworn to silence, he turned his attention to those in Ezra Marlowe's circle. Those who, by proximity or sentiment, had both opportunity and motive. Clara Willoughby had mentioned friends who wore masks. Holmes intended to unmask them one by one. Our first visit was to the offices of the Illustrated Weekly, where Marlowe had worked for over a decade. The editor-in-chief, Franklin Hoyle, greeted us with an overly warm handshake and a nervous smile that never touched his eyes. His office was a showcase of polished walnut, framed covers, and a sense of self-importance that barely veiled his discomfort. "Terrible business, this," he said, wringing his hands. "Ezra was one of our best. Sharp, fearless, and always sniffing at the edges of something dangerous." Holmes took a seat, eyes flicking across the room. "Did he often work outside the office?" "Often," said the walls muffled the truth. "He kept his secrets, though. We never knew half the stories he chased." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet he had to develop photographs somewhere. He trusted someone enough to show them." Hoyle paused, his lips parting slightly. "Well, he did use the old darkroom once last week. The one in the basement, it's rarely used. Modern facilities upstairs now. He borrowed the key. Returned it the next day. Alone, far as I know." Hoyle hesitated. "Although now that I think of it, I did see someone follow him down." Briefly. Holmes's voice cooled. "Who?" Hoyle looked away, as if calculating the least damaging answer. "Gideon March. Our political correspondent." Holmes stood. "We'll need to speak with Mr. March." March, a tall man with thinning blonde hair and an expensive cut to his suit, greeted us in the newsroom with a bland smile. "Inspector Lestrade already asked me what I knew." "Not much, I'm afraid." Holmes didn't blink. "Tell me about the night Marlowe used the darkroom." March chuckled softly. "I was passing by. Thought he might need help." He declined. "We weren't close." Holmes's gaze hardened. "And yet you followed him?" March's smile faltered. "For a moment. Curious, I suppose. But he shut the door in my face." I watched closely. March's composure was deliberate, but beneath it, I sensed irritation. A man not used to being questioned, or perhaps not used to lying well. "Did Marlowe ever speak to you of the Huxley exposure?" Holmes asked. The name seemed to catch March off guard, though he recovered quickly. "Can't say he did." Holmes stepped closer. "Strange. He developed negatives in that darkroom. One of them implicates a man you've written about, Lord Eastbourne." March's smile vanished. Holmes leaned in. "Ezra may have said nothing, but he knew. And now he's dead. I had nothing to do with it. Not directly, perhaps. But someone may have known what Ezra had, and who might leak it. He was no blackmailer. But even honorable men become dangerous when they hold truth in their hands." March's jaw tightened. "You're accusing me of..." "What?" "Passing information. That I told someone about a story I didn't even know existed." "You knew enough to follow him." Holmes replied coldly. "Enough to be curious. And curiosity kills more than cats." Before March could respond, Clara Willoughby appeared at the edge of the newsroom. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Miss Willoughby. I wasn't aware you worked here." "I don't," she said softly. "I came to collect Ezra's things." March turned to her, tone softening. "Clara, I didn't expect to see you." Something passed between them. Holmes caught it. "You know each other?" Clara looked down. "We've dated, briefly. Before I met Ezra." Holmes gave nothing away, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "Did Ezra know?" "No," she said quickly. Too quickly. March added, "It was years ago." "Yet you both neglected to mention it?" Holmes replied. "Interesting." As we stepped into the corridor, Holmes's stride lengthened. "They're hiding something, Watson." March's reaction was too controlled. Clara's too emotional. One of them was with Marlowe that night. And possibly both. We continued the rounds. Back in Kensington, Holmes interviewed Mrs. Dalrymple. Marlowe's neighbor, a prim, hawk-eyed woman, she welcomed the opportunity to share her observations. "Such a quiet man, mostly. But last week, I saw someone arguing with him on the stairwell. A woman. "Describe her," Holmes said. "Slender, dark cloak, very intense eyes. She shouted something about being betrayed." Was it Miss Willoughby? Oh no. This woman was older. Holmes turned to me as we exited. "Another voice, Watson. Someone else close to Marlowe." We returned to Baker Street to organize the pieces. Holmes lit a fire and paced, speaking aloud more to himself than to me. Marlowe had something explosive. He tried to trap the person threatening him using the camera. The shot was manipulated to hide their identity. He hid the negatives, anticipating betrayal. Now we have 3 deceptions. March claims ignorance, but clearly knew more. Clara hides their past. And someone else, an older woman, felt betrayed. He stopped pacing. "Watson, fetch that photograph again." I handed it to him. He studied it long, then pointed. "Look, barely visible. A reflection in the cabinet's glass panel behind the chair. A faint blur. But magnified, it revealed the silhouette of a person. Hair pulled back, cloak line curved. A woman. Standing just out of the camera's direct view. Not Clara," Holmes said. "The one Mrs. said." Dalrymple described. He stared at it a moment longer. The shadow in the lie just became a voice of truth. "We must find her." "And then?" I asked. "Then we listen. Because someone's about to speak a little too clearly and reveal everything they've tried to conceal." Holmes sat at the edge of his armchair, the photograph pressed against a glass plate and backlit by a small lamp on the table. The faint silhouette of the woman, indistinct, almost a smudge, seemed to flicker with life under his scrutiny. She stood there deliberately. Holmes murmured, "Just outside the camera's range, but not far enough to avoid being caught in the reflection. A calculated risk. She wanted to witness the moment, not be part of it." I stood behind him, peering at the image. Why risk being seen at all? Because she believed she wouldn't be. Or perhaps, he paused, she wanted to make sure Ezra followed through with something. A delivery? A message? Or perhaps she wanted to confirm his betrayal. "And yet," I said, "we still don't know who she is." Holmes smiled faintly. "We will." The next morning we returned to Kensington. Holmes knocked at 3 doors above and below Marlowe's flat, inquiring after any visitors or arguments the neighbors might have overheard. Most yielded nothing, save for a retired music teacher, Mr. Pargeter, who claimed he heard a woman's voice calling Marlowe a coward and a liar 2 nights before the murder. "I didn't see her, mind you," Pargeter wheezed, "but I've a good ear." Not Clara Willoughby's voice. This one was deeper, older, strained with emotion. Holmes pressed for any identifying details, but there were none. Still, the pattern sharpened. Back at Baker Street, Holmes assembled 3 columns on a sheet of foolscap: Clara Willoughby, Gideon March, and an unnamed woman, marked only with a question mark. He began listing motives beneath each. Clara: jealousy, fear of betrayal, knowledge of Marlowe's possession of sensitive material, March: professional rivalry, possible collusion with political contacts, access to the darkroom, unknown woman: emotional connection, anger. The words betrayal and cowardice suggested something personal, perhaps even romantic. Holmes tapped his pencil. Why must look at who gains, not from Marlowe's death, but from his silence? I nodded. Clara inherits nothing. She wasn't married to him. And March, though ambitious, would gain little unless he feared exposure, Holmes finished, or was protecting someone who did. A knock interrupted us. Lestrade entered, coat dusted with July rain, a folder under his arm. "I've something curious," he said, handing the file to Holmes. Records from the registry office. A woman named Adela Rowntree filed a complaint against Ezra Marlowe 4 years ago, claiming breach of promise. Holmes raised his eyebrows. Now that is intriguing. Dismissed, Lestrade said. But she pursued it aggressively. She vanished from the press after that, rumors of a nervous collapse. And her current whereabouts. Dorset, supposedly. But I found something better. She returned to London last week. Checked into a boarding house in Bloomsbury under her maiden name. Holmes was on his feet instantly. Come, Watson. We arrived at the boarding house just after noon. The landlady confirmed a Miss Adela Blackthorne was staying there. Mid-40s. Reclusive. Paid in advance. Holmes handed her a card. Tell her Mr. Marlowe's solicitor wishes to speak to her about a pending matter of inheritance. We waited 5 minutes before a thin woman descended the staircase. Her face, though lined with age and grief, still bore remnants of striking beauty. Her eyes, deep, grey, haunted, met Holmes's with barely concealed suspicion. There is no inheritance, she said flatly. Ezra is dead. Holmes bowed. You're correct. Miss Blackthorne, or should I say Miss Rowntree, she flinched. I don't know what you want. I want the truth. She hesitated, then sighed. Then come upstairs. But I'll say this, I didn't kill him. Her room was sparse. A valise near the bed, and on the desk an old leather-bound notebook. She sat across from us, folding her hands. I loved him once, she said. He promised to marry me, then vanished. Sent a letter saying his career needed focus. I believed him. Then I saw him in the papers, with Clara Willoughby on his arm. Holmes said nothing. I came back because I heard he was poking into politics again. The Huxley exposure. He'd once told me he'd never use a camera to destroy a man. Only to illuminate. But this was dangerous. I thought he was trying to fix what he'd done to me by exposing someone else. So I warned him, begged him to stop. He said it was too late. You argued, she nodded. Yes, loudly. I hated him in that moment. But I didn't kill him. Holmes asked. Did you see anyone else near the flat? Her eyes narrowed. Gideon March. He was there when I arrived. He left just as I came in. I think he saw me, but said nothing. Outside, Holmes looked grim. The web tightens. Now every suspect has a motive, Watson. Clara, jealousy, perhaps guilt. March, ambition, and proximity to the political world Marlowe threatened. And Adela, revenge. Each has reason. But who acted? I followed his thoughts. March knew about the photographs. Clara feared exposure. Adela wanted closure. Yet none of them seemed to line up cleanly. Precisely. The motive maze. Holmes stopped at the corner and hailed a cab. We returned to the newspaper. There's one more piece to examine. The assignment board. At the Illustrated Weekly, Holmes examined the records. Ezra Marlowe's final logged assignment had been vague. Private series. Personal discretion. But the date was notable. It matched the week Gideon March was absent, supposedly at a political summit in Bath. Holmes traced the office itinerary. Strange. No ticket receipts. No telegrams. No articles filed during that period. He looked up. March lied. He never left London. Lestrade arrived moments later, eyes wide. Holmes, you were right to suspect March. We just searched his flat. Found photographic chemicals and a print of the same group shot. Eastburn and the others. He'd made copies. Holmes's jaw clenched. He was preparing leverage, or insurance. He didn't want the exposure suppressed. He wanted to control it. But why kill Marlowe? I asked. Holmes's voice was hard. Because Marlowe wouldn't sell, he believed in truth. March believed in utility. And that made him dangerous. We all turned as the editor, Franklin Hoyle, appeared, face pale. There's more, he said. March submitted a new piece this morning. A scathing exposé on government corruption. Said he had new material from an anonymous source. Holmes narrowed his eyes. He's rewriting the narrative before we can reveal the truth. He turned to me. Tonight, Watson, we pay Mr. March a final visit, and this time, we bring everything into the light. Nightfall crept over London as Holmes and I arrived at Gideon March's flat in Marylebone. A uniformed constable stood at the door, tipping his hat as Lestrade met us with an odd gleam of triumph in his eye. "We've got him, Holmes," he said before we even reached the threshold. A freshly developed photograph found hidden under the floorboards behind March's bookcase, an exact match to the one Marlowe took. Same angle, same group, but this time Lord Eastbourne's face is fully visible. Holmes raised an eyebrow. A copy. More than that. There's an inscription on the back, written by Marlowe, apparently. Dated the day before his death. Lestrade pulled the photo from a protective sleeve and passed it to Holmes. Scrawled in firm, deliberate ink, "The truth must come to light. If I do not live to see it, let this speak in my place." I felt a jolt in my chest. It was exactly the kind of final declaration that would make the newspapers howl and the courts thunder. Holmes, however, examined it with clinical detachment. "Curious," he murmured, "and convenient." Lestrade frowned. "You doubt the man wrote it." "I doubt the timing. Ezra Marlowe was a meticulous man. Why write such a note on a photograph if he intended to live? And if he sensed danger, why not entrust the image to someone reliable? Clara, perhaps, or even his solicitor." Lestrade shrugged. Maybe he wanted it hidden. Insurance. Then why not keep it among the negatives in his drawer? Holmes asked flatly. "No, Inspector. This was planted, and poorly at that." Lestrade's jaw tightened. The forensics team confirmed Marlowe's handwriting. "I don't doubt the ink is his," Holmes said. "But consider, the photograph bears no fingerprints, not even Marlowe's, and the floorboard it was hidden beneath, recently pried up, with a crowbar that still sat in March's closet, mind you, showing no trace of dust or age. I saw it then. The picture was too clean, too staged, a planted victory. Still, the authorities surged ahead. March was arrested by morning. The press descended like vultures on fresh carrion. Headlines screaming, "Political scandal, murder solved," and "March confesses to exploiting dead journalists' secrets." Though in truth, he'd said little beyond. No comment. Holmes watched the chaos unfold with a grim patience. "They've caught a fox in the henhouse. Watson," he muttered over breakfast, "but the wolf still roams free. Do you think March planted the photo himself?" Holmes shook his head. "No. If he had, he would never have left it for someone to find. March is arrogant, yes, but careful. He wouldn't leave evidence to be discovered accidentally." "Then who?" I asked. Holmes sipped his tea, eyes narrowing. "Someone who needed a quick ending. Someone who feared what would come next." The image of Franklin Hoyle came to mind. The editor had pushed hard to shield the paper's name. And Clara Willoughby, though shaken, had been quick to let sleeping secrets lie. Holmes, as if reading my thoughts, stood abruptly. "We visit Miss Willoughby. Now." We found Clara at her flat in Richmond. She appeared composed, even relieved. "So it's done then?" she asked as we entered. "Gideon March is in custody." "For the moment," Holmes replied, walking past her into the sitting room without invitation. "And yet I find myself unsettled." "As I believe you are," she faltered. "Why would I be?" "Because the man you loved is still dead. Because his killer walks free. And because you, above all others, know Ezra would never leave behind such a staged message." Clara swallowed hard. "You think I did it?" "No," Holmes said, surprising us both. "But I think you know who did." She turned away, knuckles whitening around a teacup. Ezra was planning to go public. He said if he couldn't publish through the weekly, he'd take the photographs directly to Lord Eastbourne's rivals. When did he tell you this? The night before he died. He was scared. Said someone had been following him. Did he mention a name? She hesitated. Only that he no longer trusted his editor, Franklin Hoyle. She nodded. They argued that afternoon. Ezra came home furious. Said Hoyle had offered him money to delay the story. A lot of it. Holmes's expression grew grim. Which would make sense, if Hoyle were paid to keep it buried. Clara looked down. You think Hoyle had him killed? Holmes moved to the mantel and ran his finger along the wood. I think Hoyle feared that March, ambitious as he was, would take the story public once Marlowe was gone. So he fabricated a trail, planted the photograph, forged the narrative, and pointed everything to the man already under suspicion. Clara's voice dropped. Then you have to stop him. Holmes's gaze darkened. I intend to. We left her flat and made our way directly to the Illustrated Weekly. Hoyle was in his office, phone in hand, dictating loudly to someone on the other end. He ended the call as we entered, a theatrical sigh escaping his lips. Or Mr. Holmes. Inspector Lestrade tells me the case is closed. Surely you didn't come to reopen it. I came, Holmes said, to inform you that the forgery you planted beneath March's floorboard was a clumsy attempt at resolution, and the real evidence still eludes you. Hoyle chuckled. What on earth are you implying? That Ezra Marlowe's negatives, his real negatives, are in my possession. Not the doctored copies March made. Not the staged photograph you used to ensure his arrest. The originals. Hoyle paled. Holmes stepped forward. You see, I had the drawer opened the day after the murder. Ezra anticipated betrayal. He left the evidence with a friend, knowing he might not return. But you couldn't afford to wait for someone else to find the truth. So you made your own. You've no proof, Hoyle said through gritted teeth. But I will. Especially now that I've given you something to fear. Holmes turned on his heel and exited. I followed, my heart racing. In the cab? I asked. That was a bluff. Holmes allowed himself the smallest of smiles. For now. But what if he calls it? Then we'll be ready. Because now, Watson, we no longer hunt in the dark. He looked out the window, voice low and cold. The wolf knows we've seen its shadow, and it will strike again soon. 2 days passed in silence, broken only by the rustle of newspapers lauding Scotland Yard's efficiency, and the public's eagerness to forget the discomforting questions Holmes had raised. March remained in custody, neither confessing nor denying the charges, and Franklin Hoyle returned to publishing with renewed confidence. But Holmes was not idle. He had retreated into a strange quiet, smoking furiously and scribbling notes on scraps of paper with a kind of manic patience, as though waiting for the past to whisper something the present refused to tell. It was on the 3rd day that the whisper came. We were at Baker Street. The early hours of morning creeping in through the curtains, when Holmes suddenly stood from his armchair and retrieved a thick brown folder from his files. He flipped it open and spread its contents across the table. Do you recall the Wexley forgery affair from 5 years ago? He asked without preamble. I blinked. The banker who faked his own death and vanished to Tangier. Not that one, Holmes replied curtly. The lesser-known one. Edwin Wexley. He ran a private investment firm, promising extravagant returns to wealthy patrons. Among them, Lord Eastbourne. I sat up straighter. Eastbourne. The same Eastbourne Marlowe exposed in his photographs. Indeed, Holmes said, tapping the page. Wexley's scheme collapsed. Dozens ruined. reputations destroyed. But Eastbourne emerged unscathed. His name was carefully scrubbed from the public record. No official inquiry. No parliamentary censure. Curious, don't you think? I remember no coverage at the time. Because there wasn't any, Holmes replied. And guess who was editor of the Illustrated Weekly at the time? My breath caught. Hoyle. Holmes nodded grimly. He buried the scandal. Just as he tried to do again. There's a history of selective silence here. Watson. A quiet erasure of truths too damaging to powerful men. But how does Wexley fit in? I believe he remerged under a new identity. I haven't confirmed it. But there's a striking resemblance between Edwin Wexley and Charles Lorimer, the so-called financial advisor who now handles Eastbourne's private investments. I found a photograph of Wexley in an old court brief, same eyes, same signature in early documents. Holmes spread two images side by side, one grainy and old, the other clipped from a recent society column. It was undeniable. The man had vanished only to return in another guise. If Wexley and Hoyle worked together once to cover Eastbourne's tracks, it's likely they've done so again. And that means... Holmes was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, breathless. A letter, Mr. Holmes. No stamp. Delivered by hand. He took it with a frown, broke the seal, and read quickly. Then he passed it to me without a word. You were right. The real negatives still exist. But not for long. Midnight. The glasshouse behind Marlowe's studio. Come alone. There was no signature. I looked up. A trap. Almost certainly, Holmes said. But also an opportunity. The glasshouse behind Marlowe's studio was a forgotten shell of iron and stained panes, overgrown with ivy and neglected long before its owner's death. Holmes approached it cautiously just before midnight, his silhouette tight and alert. I kept my distance as instructed, concealed in the alley behind the studio's outer wall. Inside, dim lamplight flickered. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Clara Willoughby. Holmes's tone remained even. You summoned me. She glanced around nervously. I wasn't followed. No. But you will be watched now? I found something, she whispered. In Ezra's darkroom, something he hid in a hollow space beneath the sink. I didn't tell you earlier because I was frightened. I thought if I kept it, I'd be safe. Holmes said nothing, letting the silence press her. She opened her satchel and drew out a black envelope. Inside were 3 negatives, neatly protected in tissue. Holmes held one up to the lamplight. They show more than the rally, she said. They show Lord Eastbourne meeting with Charles Lorimer. But it's not just politics, they're exchanging documents. Large sums, bank transfers. Possibly bribes. Holmes examined the second negative. This one shows Marlowe seated at a cafe. Taken from a distance. Clara nodded. Ezra told me someone was watching him. He didn't know who. Holmes's face hardened. Then they photographed him, followed him, and when persuasion failed they silenced him. A twig snapped outside. Holmes tensed. Go, he said. Out the side door. Take the alley. Get to the nearest cab. Do not stop. But... No time, she fled. A moment later 2 men burst into the glasshouse. Holmes ducked, rolling behind an overturned bench. One of the intruders fired. A sharp crack that shattered a pane behind him. I surged from my hiding place, revolver drawn, and fired into the air. The sound scattered the assailants long enough for Holmes to lunge forward and tackle one. The other escaped into the night. We stood in the ruined glasshouse, breathless, the captured man groaning on the floor. Holmes turned him over. It was Charles Lorimer. Well, Holmes said coldly, at last, the past shows its face. He turned to me, eyes bright with fury and satisfaction. Now, Watson. We finally know where the rot began, and where it ends. Lorimer sat bound in a wooden chair within the confines of Baker Street, his silence more damning than a confession. Holmes paced slowly, his lean fingers steepled beneath his chin. The man had said nothing since his capture, no threats, no pleas, no denials. Only the look in his eyes betrayed him, a quiet calculation, weighing how much time he had left before his allies would move. "What cannot hold him indefinitely," I said under my breath. "The Yard will demand his release." Holmes gave no answer. Only a half smile as he stepped toward the table and adjusted the gaslight so it illuminated Lorimer's face more starkly. "I believe," Holmes said quietly, "that Mr. Lorimer is not half so afraid of us as he is of someone else. The question is whom?" Still no reply from the man in the chair. Holmes moved to his desk and produced a thin case. From it, he drew a small glass vial and a silver, tipped pet, filled it with a few drops of liquid, and then took a blank sheet of photographic paper. "You are familiar with silver nitrate, I assume," Holmes said casually, holding the vial up so the faint chemical shimmer caught Lorimer's eye. "Common enough in the world of photographers and chemists. A marvelous substance, really. It reveals what the naked eye cannot see." Holmes began to speak slowly, deliberately, applying the solution to the paper in looping, abstract strokes. "I took the liberty of having the negatives developed. The photographs will soon be ready for the public record. But what fascinated me, Mr. Lorimer, was not the images themselves, but what they failed to capture." Lorimer blinked. A twitch, subtle but present. Holmes continued painting with the chemical, creating what looked like random swirls. He then held the paper close to the lamp, allowing the warmth to begin its reaction. "You see, in one of the negatives, specifically the one of Marlowe in the cafe, there is a reflection in the glass. Faint, distorted, but unmistakable. A man watching him from across the street." Holmes turned slightly, locking eyes with the man. "It was you, wasn't it?" Still, Lorimer said nothing, but his jaw had tightened. Holmes flipped the paper toward the lamp, and slowly, faint outlines began to darken. But rather than an image, they formed words, written in Holmes's own spidery hand. "A fear is the final confession." Holmes laid the paper flat on the table and placed the chemical vial beside it. "Here's the truth. You didn't kill Marlowe. You arranged it, but you're not a killer by instinct. That was someone else's domain. And you, Mr. Lorimer, are now disposable." The silence deepened. Then Lorimer shifted. A tremor passed through him. Holmes pressed further. "Eastbourne has no reason to protect you now. The plan is complete. Marlowe is silenced, the scapegoat identified, and your usefulness exhausted." "No," Lorimer muttered, too quietly. Holmes stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There's one way out. Give me a name. The man who pulled the trigger. Who held the weapon, fired the shot. Who entered the studio through the darkroom. It wasn't you. You don't have the temperament." The silence wavered. Holmes leaned forward. "You only followed orders." Lorimer's eyes flickered. Then he whispered. "Blake?" "Blake?" I repeated, stepping forward. "Who is he?" "A fixer," Lorimer replied, voice hoarse. "Used by Hoyle and Eastbourne for matters that couldn't afford light. Former military, dishonorably discharged. He's used different names, but I've heard them speak of him in hushed tones like a ghost." Holmes straightened. "Where is he now?" "I don't know," Lorimer said quickly. "But he's paranoid. If he thinks I've talked, you already have," Holmes replied coldly, with Lorimer secured under the watch of Lestrade, who arrived minutes later. Summoned by Holmes's urgent telegram, we began the search. Holmes ever meticulous, returned to Marlowe's studio before dawn. He had noticed something odd during our earlier visit, but hadn't fully processed it until now. "I need your eyes, Watson," he said as we stood within the darkroom again, the air still tinged with chemicals and stale air. "Look at that row of negatives, specifically the numbers." I peered closely. They were numbered sequentially 51, 52, 53, then 55. "There's no 54. "Precisely," Holmes murmured, and Marlowe was nothing if not methodical. He would not have skipped a number. "So it was taken?" "No," Holmes said. "It was never hung. He must have hidden it before he could process it. And I believe I know where." He knelt by the sink and examined the hollow Clara had mentioned. Reaching in, he tapped along the back panel, then applied pressure to a seemingly solid edge. It shifted with a click, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside was a canister. Holmes removed it carefully. It was labeled 54. Back at Baker Street, he developed the frame in silence. When the image finally emerged, we both leaned in. It was not political, not scandalous. It was personal. A photograph of Clara Willoughby, weeping. In the background, blurred but distinct, was the reflection of another man, slim, severe, standing just inside the doorframe. The same man from the cafe reflection. And now, clearly visible, a tattoo on his forearm, a serpent curled around a dagger. Holmes tapped the glass. Blake. He was following her too. Which means Clara's danger is far from over. I felt a chill as Holmes turned away from the photograph and poured fresh tea with a steady hand. They wanted Marlowe silenced. But Clara, she's the last link, and Blake won't leave loose ends. He glanced at the clock. "We'll need to move quickly, Watson. There's one final game to play. And I suspect it will be our most dangerous yet." The morning had barely broken when we arrived at Scotland Yard to retrieve the photograph Holmes had personally delivered the night before. The image of Clara Willoughby, captured mid-tears with Blake's reflection haunting the background, was to be the linchpin, connecting the assassin to both Marlowe and Clara, and by extension to Hoyle and Eastbourne. Holmes had insisted it be held under lock and key until the evening, when he intended to confront Eastbourne directly. But the moment we entered Inspector Gregson's office, a knot tightened in my stomach. The metal strongbox on his desk sat open, empty. Gregson stood with his arms folded, face like granite. "I swear, Holmes, it was here at midnight. No sign of forced entry." "The key never left my pocket." Holmes said nothing. He approached the box, examined the lock, and then the edges of the desk. He sniffed the rim of the container and frowned. Reaching into his coat, he retrieved a magnifying lens and peered at the hinges. "Chloroform," he murmured. "Someone knocked out the clerk on duty," Gregson confirmed grimly. "Came in through the roof access. Slipped past the night guard. Clean work. Quiet." Holmes straightened slowly, lips pressed into a thin line. "Then they know." Gregson narrowed his eyes. "Know what?" "That we're too close." In the hallway outside, Holmes turned to me. "We must assume Blake, or someone working for him, took the photograph. Which means our time is not just limited, it's almost gone." "What do we do now?" I asked. "We find another path. A thief leaves traces, even when they think they've vanished." Back at Baker Street, Holmes unrolled a set of blueprints, schematics of the yard's ventilation system he had once acquired for a separate case. Tracing a route from the roof to the evidence room, he paused at a junction labeled B4, a narrow shaft that dropped into the clerk's corridor. He tapped it. Only someone intimately familiar with this building could navigate this route. Blake may be a ghost, but someone gave him the map. An insider. Holmes's eyes darkened. Or worse, someone with a uniform. The next move was calculated and immediate. Holmes sent a message to Clara through her solicitor, summoning her discreetly to Baker Street. When she arrived, pale and anxious, Holmes welcomed her with a warmth I had rarely seen him extend. "You're in grave danger, Miss Willoughby," he said without delay. "Blake is aware of your connection to the photograph." Her composure broke. "Then it's all lost, isn't it?" "No," Holmes replied firmly. "But we must anticipate their next move. Someone wants you silenced. We intend to use that." Clara looked between us hesitant. "Use me how?" Holmes's voice dropped. "A's bait." The plan was perilous, but Holmes was resolute. That evening, we staged a decoy. Clara would visit her old photography studio under the pretense of retrieving a forgotten portfolio. Lestrade and his men, hidden in wait, would apprehend any intruder. Holmes and I positioned ourselves on the rooftop across the street, binoculars trained on the windows. But the trap never sprung. Hours passed. The only figure to appear was Clara herself, nervously shuffling papers, waiting. When we finally descended, we found her shaken but unharmed. No Blake, no movement. Only one thing had changed. The back door, previously sealed, now stood ajar. Holmes stepped inside first, sweeping his gaze across the shelves. Then he froze. A dark smear marked the far cabinet, resin or soot. The developing trays had been overturned, and every photograph in the filing cabinet, every negative, every print, every last record of Marlowe's studio was gone. Burned. Clara let out a gasp, covering her mouth as she stepped forward. "No, no. They were here this morning." Holmes crouched near the ashes. "Not just sabotage," he said. "Barrageur?" He stood, brushing soot from his fingertips. "Someone doesn't merely want to hide the truth. They want to make it cease to exist." That night, back at Baker Street, the atmosphere was thick with frustration. Holmes had withdrawn into his silent spiral, his violin untouched, his pipe long gone cold. He stood before the window, unmoving, eyes fixed on something far beyond the lamplight. I finally broke the silence. "We're losing ground, Holmes." "No, Watson," he replied softly. "We're losing time." I didn't press. Not until the knock came. It was Gregson, coat dusted with rain, hat in hand, face grave. "I found something," he said. "Or rather, someone tried to make sure I wouldn't." He handed Holmes a scrap of charred paper, wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes unrolled it carefully. It was a ledger fragment, singed at the edges but legible. The ink had smeared slightly from the heat, but a single name stood out, clear and damning: Edward Blake, temporary permit, signed by G. Hoyle. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Proof," I whispered. "Hoyle brought him in." "No," Holmes said. "Hoyle made him." Holmes looked up at us, voice low, deadly calm. "Gentlemen, this is no longer about justice. It is now about prevention. Blake will strike again, and when he does, it will not be for silence. It will be for survival." The window rattled slightly in the breeze. Holmes didn't move. "He knows we're coming. The question is, can we reach him before he disappears again, or before someone else does?" The storm came without warning, heavy with sleet and wind that howled like some primal beast. It was just past midnight when the first telegram arrived, an urgent summons to Scotland Yard. A second murder had occurred. The name scrawled across the page chilled me: Gregory Hoyle. Holmes said nothing for a moment, his fingers tightening around the thin paper until it crumpled. "He's cleaning house," he muttered. We reached the scene in under 20 minutes. Hoyle's body lay slumped against the stone wall of his Mayfair townhouse courtyard, his overcoat stiff with rain and blood. A single bullet had struck him behind the left ear. Precise, clinical. There were no witnesses, no signs of forced entry, no struggle. His personal guards had been dismissed hours earlier, apparently at Hoyle's own command. Lestrade shook his head as we stepped beneath the gas lamps. It's the same style as Marlowe, one shot, silent. A ghost walks among us, Holmes. Holmes didn't respond. He knelt beside the corpse, studying Hoyle's hand. Still curled as though clutching something, except it was empty. No weapon, no clue. But Holmes's eyes narrowed. There was something here, he whispered. Paper. Folded, pulled free post-mortem. Likely by the killer. Could have been a confession, Lestrade offered. Or a list, Holmes said, of those left to die. The coroner approached quietly, but Holmes waved him back. Not yet. I want 10 minutes with the room. Inside Hoyle's study. The fire had been left burning, the decanter on his desk untouched. A single chair had been pulled forward from the wall, facing Hoyle's own, directly across the room. Holmes examined its legs, then tilted it slightly. He pointed to a smear along the floorboards. Weil, bicycle chain lubricant. Blake again, or someone deliberately mimicking his methods. Lestrade looked up sharply. You're saying this might not be Blake? I'm saying, Holmes said, that the killer wanted us to think it was him. I frowned. But why? What would they gain by framing the very man already guilty of murder? Because the moment we stop searching for others, Holmes said quietly, we give the real hand behind all this the freedom to move again. He straightened abruptly. We need Clara. Why? I asked. Because Blake might not be the only one who knows the whole truth. Back at Baker Street, the message we'd sent to Clara went unanswered. Her lodgings, we learned, had been abandoned. The concierge at her building said she'd checked out an hour after we left the yard, with no explanation and no forwarding address. Holmes stared at the empty foyer, eyes unreadable. She ran, I said quietly. No, Holmes replied. She was made to disappear. There was urgency now, thick as fog. Holmes began tracing connections again, not on a chalkboard, but across the flat's dining table. Thread ink, names, Clara Hoyle, Eastbourne Blake, each marked in red. A new name emerged from a report Lestrade sent that evening. Francis Linton, a retired intelligence clerk, once suspected of forging war dispatches. Her name had been found on the ledger fragment recovered from Hoyle's fireplace. According to records, she had vanished 2 years ago. Also, it seemed, she never disappeared. Holmes murmured. She changed her name. To what? To Helen Eastbourne. The silence was immediate. My pulse surged. You're suggesting Clara's aunt is the final piece? She's more than an aunt, Holmes said. She's the architect. It made a cruel kind of sense. Eastbourne had taken in Clara just after her parents' death. She had introduced her to photography, funded her studio, moved with her to London. If Eastbourne had once served in a role involving document manipulation or intelligence gathering, she would possess the very skills Blake required. Invisibility, infiltration, and silence. And she had motive. Hoyle and Marlowe had been part of her old world. The same world that might have betrayed or discarded her. Perhaps Blake had once been her asset, a tool reactivated for revenge. But why Clara? Why involve someone so close? Before we could answer that, a knock came, rapid, urgent. It was Gregson. Holmes, you need to come. Now. Eastbourne's house. It's burning. By the time we arrived in Highgate, flames had consumed the east wing. Firemen battled the blaze with shouts and hoses, but it was too late for rescue. Or so we were told. Inside the wreckage, 2 bodies were recovered. One, a female, middle-aged, was burned beyond recognition. The second, curiously, was identified as a man in his 30s with a bullet wound to the chest. A revolver was found near the woman's hand. Lestrade, Standing grim in the smoke, read the situation aloud. Murder, suicide. She killed Blake, then herself. Case closed. Holmes said nothing. He stared into the fire, then turned, walking toward the garden gate. I followed. You don't believe it. She wouldn't use a bullet, he said. What? Eastbourne is too meticulous. She'd use poison. Or misdirection. But not something that can be traced to a hand. And the body, he paused. That wasn't Blake. The case had twisted once again. Someone had used the blaze not to end the story, but to rewrite it. Holmes turned toward me, the orange glow of the fire flickering in his eyes. She's still out there, Watson. And Clara may still be alive. But why spare her? Holmes's voice was low. Because Clara wasn't a pawn. He looked back toward the flames. She was the prize. The embers of Eastbourne's burned estate still smouldered when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, weighed down not just by smoke, but by the unsettling certainty that the case was far from over. The supposed murder, suicide, was a grotesque fabrication. A smokescreen for something far more intricate. Holmes settled into his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, eyes glinting with that familiar spark of deduction. The key, Watson, is to observe what everyone else overlooks. The smallest detail, the one dismissed as trivial, often holds the entire truth. I nodded, though the exhaustion in my bones was heavy. Yet, as ever, Holmes's words compelled my attention. He flicked open his notebook, scanning his meticulous entries from the past days, referencing the timelines. The faces, the motives. Consider Clara's photographs, he said suddenly. We have focused too much on those who wish to manipulate her, neglecting the subject itself, her art. I frowned, recalling the prints Lestrade had brought to us early on. Stark, almost haunting images, each capturing moments that felt unnervingly staged rather than candid. The photographs seemed more like evidence than art. Holmes. Precisely, Holmes murmured. One in particular caught my eye again. The last from her studio before she disappeared. A self-portrait. But look closely. He handed me a print, the black and white image of Clara standing before a cracked mirror. The reflection was skewed, but what caught my attention was a small figure reflected in the background. A man, obscured, holding a camera at waist level. The photographer captured more than his subject, Holmes said. The figure wasn't noted before, dismissed as an incidental shadow. I studied the photograph again. The man's clothing was familiar, an old-fashioned coat, the kind worn by the East End's lower classes. But what struck me was the man's hand. The right thumb was notably crooked, bent at an unnatural angle. That's Blake's hand, Holmes said softly. How do you know? I asked. Because during the earlier investigation, I examined the corpse of the man found at Eastbourne's estate. His fingerprint records matched none other than Blake's, but the hand showed no deformity. This man is an imposter, or someone who has assumed Blake's identity. The implications twisted my thoughts. So Blake's alive, or someone wishes to make us believe so. Holmes rose abruptly, pacing. This man, the Blake in the photograph, was present at Clara's studio that night. If the real Blake had died, this is a deliberate ploy to confuse the investigation. Then who is he? Holmes stopped, pointing to a name scrawled faintly on the photograph's corner, M. Collingwood. The name corresponds to a minor criminal, a forger with connections to Francis Linton, Eastbourne's other identity. He disappeared shortly before the first murder. I recalled Lestrade's mention of a forged letter found among Eastbourne's belongings. Letters designed to manipulate her targets. You think Collingwood was working with Eastbourne? More than that, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. He was the enforcer, the one who masqueraded as Blake to intimidate and eliminate. But the true mastermind remains hidden. Holmes sat again, steepling his fingers. Now consider the burned body. It wasn't Blake nor Eastbourne. It was Collingwood. The killer staged the scene to eliminate a loose end and cover their trail. The room seemed to grow colder as Holmes's deductions unraveled the final threads. Our suspect is someone with access. Someone who knew the past but is playing a long game. I glanced at the prints again. Something still unsettled me. The choice of subjects, the angles, the shadows. Holmes. What if the photographs themselves are the message? Holmes's eyes lit up. Exactly, Watson. Clara's images were never mere portraits. They were warnings encoded in light and shadow. The cracked mirror, the hidden figure, the deliberate framing, all clues sent to someone who would know how to read them. A slow smile crept across Holmes's face. This is no simple crime. It is a game of chess played by masters, each move a message, each victim a sacrifice. And where does Clara fit in? I pressed. Holmes leaned back, fingers tapping his lips thoughtfully. She is both player and pawn. Protected by the killer, yet endangered by proximity. They needed her silence, and her photographs, to manipulate the narrative. The pattern was clear now, emerging from the chaos like the first rays of dawn piercing a storm. Holmes rose, eyes sharp as daggers. We must anticipate the next move, Watson. This game is far from over, and the real criminal is preparing to strike once more. I caught the steely resolve in his voice, knowing that whatever lay ahead would test us beyond reason. But one certainty remained: the truth, buried in shadow and light, was finally within reach. The morning light filtered weakly through the drawn curtains of 221B Baker Street, casting long shadows across the room as Holmes and I sat over a spread of photographs, letters, and crime scene sketches. The pieces of the puzzle had begun to coalesce, yet the heart of the mystery, the true motive, still eluded us. Holmes was unusually silent, his gaze fixed on a crumpled letter we had recovered from a secret compartment in Eastbourne's studio. "The motive, Watson," he said softly, "is rarely what it seems on the surface. Greed, jealousy, revenge. These are often distractions from a deeper, more personal truth." I leaned forward, curiosity piqued. "You suspect there's something more. What could drive someone to such calculated cruelty beyond the obvious?" Holmes tapped the letter with a slender finger. "Observe this. A correspondence between Francis Linton, Eastbourne's true identity, and a man named Gerald Holloway. The tone is intimate, almost desperate. But the content is troubling." I read the letter carefully. It spoke not of money or power, but of betrayal, shame, and a secret best left buried. The writer hinted at an event long ago, a scandal involving a ruined reputation, a lost love, and a promise to never speak of it again. "Could this scandal be the key?" I asked. Holmes nodded. Indeed, Eastbourne's outward persona, the wealthy heiress, the socialite, was a carefully constructed mask to hide this shame. The crimes we've seen, the murders, the threats, they are desperate attempts to silence those who knew the truth. I glanced at Holmes, whose eyes burned with intensity. But why involve Clara? Why the elaborate ruse with the photographs? Holmes's fingers twitched as if pulling invisible threads. Because Clara was the one person who could expose the truth, not just through words but through images. Her camera captured what others tried to hide. The villain feared that Clara's art would reveal the scandal and unravel the carefully woven farce aid. Just then, there was a sharp knock at the door. Lestrade entered, looking unusually grave. "Holmes, we've received a report, another break-in at the studio. This time, Clara's photographs have been stolen. The room seemed to tighten with tension. Holmes's eyes flashed with determination. They want to bury the truth, Watson. But in doing so they only reveal their desperation. As the investigation deepened, we discovered that the scandal involved not only Francis Linton, but also a close, knit circle of influential figures, each with their own secrets to protect. The murderer's psychology emerged: a man consumed by fear of disgrace, willing to destroy lives to preserve his reputation. Holmes summarized it succinctly. The crime was never about wealth or power alone. It was about control. Control over narrative, over memory, over truth itself. In that moment, the chilling reality settled in. The villain's darkest motive was a primal fear of exposure, a willingness to commit unspeakable acts, to keep a past buried forever. And until that secret was brought to light, the cycle of violence would continue. Holmes's voice was resolute. We must unmask the villain before more lives are lost. The hidden motive is our key, Watson. And it's time to use it. The rain hammered relentlessly against the windows of Baker Street as twilight gave way to night. Holmes and I sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting elongated shadows as he laid out the plan with meticulous precision. The pieces were finally aligned. The hidden motive had drawn the culprit into a fragile web, one so delicate that a single thread pulled could unravel the entire conspiracy. Holmes's eyes, sharp and unyielding, met mine. This is no ordinary confrontation, Watson. The villain's desperation will be their undoing, but they are dangerous. We must be prepared for every eventuality. I nodded, feeling the weight of what was to come. The figure who had manipulated, deceived, and killed was close, too close, and now we had the advantage. We chose the setting with care. The old studio where Clara had first revealed the photographs that had begun to pierce the darkness. It was a place thick with history. Secrets layered like dust on every surface. Holmes had arranged for the key suspects to be gathered under the pretense of examining newly discovered evidence. As the evening wore on, the tension became palpable. Frances Linton entered last, her composure brittle but eyes sharp. The faintest tremor betrayed the fear beneath her poised exterior. Holmes began calmly, "Ms. Linton, or should I say, Frances Eastbourne, you stand accused not only of murder, but of weaving a dangerous web of lies to protect a secret long buried." A flash of anger, then cold calculation, crossed her face. "You have nothing on me, Holmes. Your theories are fantasies." "Ah, but the evidence tells another story," he replied, producing the photographs and letters, each detail connecting her to the crimes and the motive. "Your carefully constructed facade is cracking." Frances's gaze flickered to the corner where I stood watchful, noting her every reaction. Holmes stepped closer, voice steady yet unyielding. "You feared exposure more than anything. The scandal that once threatened to ruin you." "It's not true," she burst out, but her voice faltered. Holmes held up a final piece. The forged letter meant to implicate innocent parties, penned in her distinctive handwriting, but traced back to Collingwood's style. "You used Collingwood to silence those who could speak, to create chaos and mislead the investigation. But the truth has a way of surfacing." For a moment, silence thickened the room like a fog. Then, with a shuddering breath, Frances slumped, defeated. "Yes," she whispered. "It was necessary. For my survival." Before more could be said, a sudden commotion erupted near the back door. A shadowy figure darted toward the street, intent on escape. Holmes sprang into action, his long legs covering the distance with lethal speed. I followed, heart pounding. The culprits stumbled into the rain-soaked alley, their coat billowing like a dark cloud. Holmes caught them by the arm with an iron grip. You are not going anywhere." The villain twisted, desperation fueling a last-ditch struggle, but Holmes's calm precision prevailed. "Your game is over." As the constables arrived to secure the scene, Holmes returned to the studio, where Francis sat silently, the mask finally shattered. "The pattern has emerged, Watson," he said softly. "The truth, no matter how deeply buried, cannot be hidden forever." I stood beside him, knowing this case was closed not just by the facts, but by the indomitable will to see justice done. In the shadows of deception, Holmes's keen eye had uncovered the heart of darkness and brought it into the light. The morning after the arrest brought a fragile calm to Baker Street. The rain had ceased, leaving the city washed clean, but inside the flat, a different atmosphere prevailed, one charged with an uneasy anticipation. Holmes sat by the window, fingers steepled, eyes distant yet focused. The case had ostensibly closed with Francis Eastbourne's confession and the capture of the would-be escapee, but Holmes's expression betrayed no satisfaction. "Holmes," I ventured, "you seem troubled. Has the villain's capture not put an end to this ordeal?" He turned to me with a faint, inscrutable smile. "On the contrary, Watson. The conclusion we reached is neat, almost too neat. Human affairs rarely tidy themselves so conveniently." I nodded, recalling the tangled web we had unraveled and the sudden chaos of last night's pursuit. Yet Holmes's intuition, ever a razor's edge, was restless. Before I could press further, a sharp rap echoed from the door. Lestrade entered, face grim and holding a small envelope sealed with a peculiar crest neither of us recognized. "This arrived an hour ago, sir," Lestrade said. "No sender. No explanation." Holmes took the envelope, breaking the seal with care. Inside was a single photograph and a brief note, written in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. "You have captured a pawn, but the king remains. Look closer to the camera's eye." I stared at the photograph. A grainy image from Clara's collection, previously overlooked. It depicted the studio's cluttered workspace, but my eyes caught something unusual, a faint reflection in the glass of an ornate mirror hung on the far wall. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, but Holmes's finger traced the edge. "Notice the figure barely visible, reflected behind the camera," he murmured. "A person unseen in any prior examination. Someone who should not be here." My mind raced. Could it be the real mastermind? Someone hiding in plain sight? Holmes's gaze hardened. "Precisely, Watson. Francis Eastbourne's confession now looks like a carefully crafted diversion." Without hesitation, we returned to the studio, accompanied by Lestrade and a small contingent of officers. Every surface, every shadow was scrutinized with renewed vigor. Holmes examined the mirror's angle and the position of the camera used to take the original images. Whoever took this photograph wanted to capture that figure deliberately, Holmes concluded. But why remain hidden in a reflection rather than face the lens? Suddenly, Holmes's eyes lit up with recognition. The photographer's assistant, Miss Clara Reynolds. She has been cooperating, yes, but what if her loyalty is fractured? What if she has been the unseen hand behind the curtain all along? The notion unsettled me. Clara, so earnest and frightened, now suddenly suspect. Holmes motioned for an immediate search of Clara's quarters. There, hidden beneath a false bottom in her trunk, we discovered letters and a journal. The pages chronicled a secret alliance with an influential figure desperate to keep the scandal buried, and a growing resentment toward Francis for monopolizing the spotlight. As we confronted Clara, her facade crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted to manipulating the photographs, fabricating evidence to mislead the investigation and protect her mysterious benefactor. "But why?" I demanded. Because, she sobbed, some truths are too dangerous. If they surfaced, everything, and everyone, would be destroyed. Holmes's voice was calm but firm. You underestimated the persistence of justice, Miss Reynolds. Deception may cloud the truth, but it cannot extinguish it. The revelation reconfigured the entire case. The mastermind was no longer Francis Eastbourne alone, but a tangled alliance of secrets and betrayals, with Clara Reynolds as a pivotal player. Back at Baker Street, Holmes pored over the new evidence, his mind weaving together the final threads. Watson, he said quietly, the case has tested every fiber of our deduction, but the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of clawing its way to the surface. This last-minute twist is the essence of human complexity. The masks we wear and the shadows we live in. I nodded, awed by the relentless pursuit of truth. Knowing that in the labyrinth of lies, Holmes's genius remained unmatched. The late afternoon light slanted through the dusty windows of Baker Street, painting long, thoughtful shadows on the walls. Holmes stood at the mantel, his silhouette stark against the flickering gas lamp. A letter in hand, its content, as I would soon learn, the final piece in a complex puzzle. The affair concludes, Watson, he said. Voice steady, yet laced with that curious blend of triumph and melancholy he often wore at the end of a long pursuit. But whether justice has triumphed well, that is another matter entirely. I straightened in my chair. So Clara Reynolds wasn't the final link? Holmes turned, a gleam in his eye. She was a link, yes, but not the last. As with most intricate mechanisms, there is always a key spring, an element so subtly hidden that it escapes all but the most careful inspection. Allow me to explain. He moved to the cluttered desk and drew from beneath a stack of case notes a series of prints, photographs from the studio. He laid them out in careful sequence, pointing to the reflection we'd first noticed. Clara's betrayal was real, her role instrumental. But this figure, here, he tapped the faint silhouette. This is not Clara. This is Lionel Vexley. I blinked. The magistrate's aide. Precisely. Quiet, observant, ever hovering at the periphery of power, but never assuming the spotlight. You recall, Watson, how often Vexley attended the initial proceedings, how quickly he dismissed the idea of tampering, how he insisted the camera never lies. I nodded slowly, recalling Vexley's manner. Efficient, deferential, and somehow forgettable. Too forgettable. Clara's writings revealed her torment. Holmes continued. She manipulated evidence at the instruction of someone she referred to as the protector. Vexley ensured the Eastbourne scandal remained concealed because he had the most to lose. Francis had discovered a long-buried indiscretion, one that tied Vexley to an old bribery case involving falsified testimonies in political trials. Francis, with her sharp instincts, realized the power of the camera could capture more than beauty. It could capture leverage. But then why kill her? I asked. Surely silence through persuasion would have sufficed. Holmes's expression hardened. Vexley is not a man of half measures. When Clara began to hesitate, Francis became a liability. The false photographs were a distraction, meant to point blame toward jealous rivals. Vexley orchestrated everything from the shadows, controlling the narrative, manipulating the evidence, and eliminating those who strayed from the plan. And Clara, I asked quietly, arrested this morning? Lestrade said as he entered, cap in hand. She confessed fully. But Vexley, he's gone. Gone. I echoed, vanished from his chambers. Left behind a resignation letter and a train ticket to Dover unused. We believe he fled before Clara's journals reached us. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He had time to prepare. He knew the game was nearing its end. Lestrade shook his head. "We'll circulate his description across the ports, but if he's out of the country." The sentence died, unnecessary in its completion. I looked at Holmes, half expecting him to rage at the failure. Instead, he looked calmly to the hearth. "Justice," Holmes murmured, "is not always a sword, Watson. Sometimes it is merely the light we shine upon truth. Whether that light blinds or reveals depends upon the one holding it." Later that evening, over a quiet supper, Holmes revisited the sequence of events with his characteristic clarity. The mirror, Watson. That overlooked object. Its angle, its placement. Its silent testimony. It recorded not only Francis's final session but her killer. No human witness could have seen it, but the camera did. From that reflection emerged the pattern, Clara's forged negatives, the replacement of glass plates, and most critically, the subtle alteration of timestamps on the studio's clock. He tapped the final photograph again. The lie wasn't just captured in the photograph. It was about the photograph. Francis intended to blackmail Vexley, but she underestimated his reach. Clara, coursed by loyalty and fear, crafted the false narrative. And in the end, a reflection, barely noticed, shattered it. I poured another glass of port, digesting the breadth of the scheme. So what becomes of it now? With Vexley free? Holmes shrugged. Eventually, such men grow careless. He will resurface. The truth now lives in the hands of those who cannot ignore it. Lestrade, the press, perhaps even Parliament. If nothing else, Vexley will never again walk among polite society without the chill of exposure at his back. "And you?" I asked. He gave a rare smile. "I shall rest for a few days, Watson. Even the sharpest mind must pause between storms." Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the labyrinth of lies unraveled in its midst. Somewhere beyond the fog, a fugitive blended into the crowd, believing he had escaped the long arm of justice. But Sherlock Holmes had lit the truth, and it burned quietly now, an ember waiting to blaze anew. The streets of London, cloaked in the dim blue of early morning, echoed faintly with the sound of Holmes's steady footfall as we left Scotland Yard behind. The air held a rare stillness, as if the city itself were holding its breath after the storm. The Vexley affair had been filed, locked, and catalogued, its loose ends seemingly tied. And yet, Holmes walked with a peculiar silence that I had come to recognize over our years together. The silence of a mind not yet finished. "You're unusually quiet, Holmes," I ventured. He didn't answer at first. The flicker of gaslight caught the edge of his profile. His eyes not settled on the cobblestones ahead, but somewhere deeper inward. "Watson," he finally said, "do you recall the letter I received yesterday? The one purportedly from the Devonshire archives?" "Yes." "You mentioned it was regarding Vexley's time as clerk to the late Sir Adrian Wetherall." Holmes paused at the corner of Bloomsbury Street. Pulling the letter from his coat pocket, he handed it to me. "But I've reread it, Watson, several times, and one detail continues to disturb me." I unfolded the letter. It was brief, typed, and signed with a precise, curling flourish from a name I didn't recognize: G. Ellery Sykes, archivist. The letter confirms Vexley's association with Wetherall, but it notes Vexley's dismissal after a breach of integrity involving sealed testimonies. "The problem, Watson, is that Sir Adrian died in 1879. I frowned. "That can't be right. Vexley's clerkship was said to have ended in 1883. "Indeed," Holmes said quietly. "Unless, of course, someone fabricated his later role, an invented timeline to place him elsewhere during those years." "But why?" We resumed walking. The distant clatter of a cart breaking the silence. Holmes's hands were clasped behind his back, the collar of his coat turned up against the cold. "I believe," he continued, that Vexley's story did not begin with Francis, nor with Clara. His manipulation of legal documents, forged alibis, and reliance on misdirection suggest a history of silent influence. A pattern. I remembered the final photograph. The reflection, the camera angle. The precise planning. You think he's been involved in other cover-ups? Holmes nodded. Several, I suspect, all likely buried under polished records, false identities, and the naivety of those who never knew to look. He stopped suddenly and turned to face me, his gaze sharp. Watson. When we were at Francis's studio, I noticed something in the cabinet beside the developing trays. A small bundle wrapped in oilskin. I didn't touch it then. I presumed it part of her equipment. But last night, as I revisited the layout of the room, I realized the temperature in that corner was unusually warm. My mind reeled. A hidden compartment, possibly. Or something electrical. Frances was known for her experimentation with light and exposure times. Perhaps it was more than artistic curiosity. Perhaps she was preserving something. We turned at once and hailed a cab to Limehouse. The streets were slowly stirring. Shutters lifting and chimneys beginning their morning smoke. By the time we reached the old photography studio, the sky had turned a soft pewter. Inside, the air still carried the faint scent of chemicals and dust. Holmes moved straight to the cabinet, his hands swift and confident. He removed the trays, then the shelf beneath, exposing a narrow slot built into the back panel. From it, he drew a metal box, slightly warm to the touch. He cracked it open. Inside were 12 developed plates. Not prints. Originals. Each showed a man, sometimes in a courtroom, sometimes alone with files, sometimes speaking to men Holmes would later identify as disgraced MPs and vanished civil clerks. And always the same figure among them, Lionel Vexley. They're dated, Holmes murmured, holding them to the light, 1876 to 1883. The years he supposedly worked quietly under Wetherell. And if these are genuine, they reveal not a single man's deception, Holmes said, but a network, an underground apparatus for legal manipulation, blackmail, and judicial interference. Frances must have discovered it while researching her father's trial. These plates are her insurance. She was preparing to expose it all. A new silence fell over us, heavier this time. The case, which had seemed closed, now yawned open again, larger, darker, and more treacherous than we had imagined. We returned to Baker Street, just as the fog began to roll in. Holmes stood at the window, the box of negatives resting beside the violin. He had not spoken since our discovery. At last, he said, this will not end with Vexley. There will be others. Men who feared Frances for what she knew. Men who now fear what I might do with this. I stood beside him. What will you do? Holmes, he considered this for a long moment. Then, what I always do, Watson. Observe, deduce, and wait. The moment will come. I left Holmes at the window, watching the street, his mind already racing ahead. And as I descended the stairs into the morning mist, a single thought lingered in my mind, both a comfort and a warning. When Sherlock Holmes closes one case, he often opens another. And sometimes, the true mystery isn't the one you solve. It's the one that's just beginning.